They tried to arrest Captain Ibrahim Traoré, but something shocking happened. It was just before dawn when the convoy moved in. Armed personnel, faces grim with purpose, had their orders detain the man who had come to symbolize resistance, who had dared to challenge not only foreign influence, but the very foundation of the old power structures. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the name whispered in barracks and shouted in the streets, was now marked as a threat, not by the people, but by those who feared his growing strength. The plan was meticulous. Isolate him, take him quietly, no gunfire, no chaos, just a swift extraction and silence. But that's not how it unfolded. As the soldiers approached the compound, something extraordinary happened. Civilians began to gather dozens, then hundreds, surrounding the perimeter in a human shield. No one had called them. No orders had been given. They had simply sensed something was wrong. Word had spread through back channels, on foot, by whispers Traoré was in danger, and the people moved. What was meant to be a covert operation turned into a standoff, not with weapons, but with unity. Mothers holding children stood beside students, workers, even former soldiers. Some wept. Some prayed. All stood firm. It was as if the soul of a nation had risen up in that moment saying, "Not this one. Not him." Inside, Traoré did not flee. He did not hide. He walked calmly to the gates and stood among the people. His expression was not one of fear, but of fierce calm. He raised a hand, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement of them, of their courage, of the moment. The soldiers hesitated. Their weapons, suddenly heavy, did not rise. Orders were questioned. Loyalty shifted. These weren't just protesters in the street, they were their own families, neighbors, and friends. And standing in the center was a man who had come from among them, who had bled and fought alongside them. And so, the arrest did not happen. The convoy pulled back. No shots were fired. No one was taken. What happened that day was more than resistance. It was a revelation that real power does not always lie in weapons or titles, but in the will of people who have decided they will no longer be afraid. They tried to arrest Captain Ibrahim Traoré, but in doing so, they awakened something far more powerful than they expected. The spirit of a people who refused to let their future be stolen again. The attempted arrest of Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not a random act of enforcement, but a calculated move made by those who feared the influence he had come to wield. Traoré had risen not just through the military ranks, but through the hearts of ordinary people, earning a reputation as a leader who spoke truth to power and stood up for national sovereignty. His growing popularity unsettled many in the traditional power circles, those who had long benefited from foreign alliances, corrupt institutions, and the silencing of dissenting voices. To them, Traoré was not just a soldier, he was a symbol of disruption, a threat to everything they had worked to preserve. The arrest was planned with precision. A convoy of heavily armed personnel, operating under confidential orders, moved at the edge of dawn. The strategy was to act swiftly, quietly, and without confrontation. Their mission was to isolate Traoré, detain him before the public could react, and transport him to an undisclosed location for questioning. There would be no press coverage, no official announcements, just silence and containment. From their point of view, it was supposed to be just another controlled operation in a country where such moves were often met with resignation. But this time, it didn't go as planned. Word of the operation, despite all the precautions, leaked. Perhaps it was a sympathetic officer, a civilian employee, or someone simply paying attention. But by the time the convoy reached the edge of the compound where Traoré was staying, people had already started gathering. At first, it was a few locals, men and women, who had heard whispers and came to see for themselves. But the crowd grew rapidly, almost like something out of instinct. Phones were not needed. No one posted anything. The message spread through voices, footsteps, and intuition. The people knew their captain was in danger. Within an hour, hundreds had surrounded the area. They were not militants, not organized political actors, but ordinary citizens, students, laborers, mothers with children on their backs, elders leaning on canes. They formed a wall with their bodies, standing shoulder to shoulder in silence at first, then chanting, praying, refusing to move. Some carried small flags, others held handmade signs. Most had nothing but their presence, It wasn't violence that met the armed convoy, it was resolve, and it shook the operation to its core.
Inside the compound, Captain Traoré was fully aware of what was happening. He could have escaped, he had the means, but he chose not to. Instead, he walked out calmly, unarmed, and took his place beside the people. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't plead. He simply stood among them, the man they had come to protect. That moment, simple yet powerful, became the turning point. The people saw that he would not abandon them, and more importantly, the soldiers saw it too. The military personnel sent to detain him began to falter. They saw the crowd not as a mob, but as faces they recognized. Some saw cousins, neighbors, old friends from school. A few recognized fellow veterans who had once served under the same flag. The line between duty and morality began to blur. The orders they had received began to feel hollow. Could they push past unarmed citizens who had nothing but belief in a man? Could they detain someone who wasn't hiding behind walls, but standing among the people? The decision not to act didn't come from any commander's order. It came from hesitation, from human instinct, from the realization that this was bigger than one man. Slowly, one by one, the vehicles reversed. The troops pulled back. There were no arrests that day, no gunshots, no detentions, only silence, and then a wave of cheers and tears as the people understood what had just occurred. A silent coup attempt had failed, not because of military strategy or political maneuvering, but because of human will. What happened that morning was more than just the prevention of an arrest, it was a public reckoning. Those in power realized they could no longer act in shadows. The people, once seen as passive observers of political games, had made themselves the main actors. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just a man in uniform. He had become something else entirely, a reflection of national consciousness, of defiance, and of hope. And that, more than any failed operation, is what truly shocked the nation. When news began to spread that Captain Ibrahim Traoré was about to be arrested, the reaction was immediate and instinctive. It didn't come from political parties or organized activist groups. It didn't start with a rallying cry or a social media campaign. It started in the streets, in homes, in the hearts of people who sensed that something deeply unjust was unfolding. Ordinary citizens, men, women, children, the elderly moved almost as one, heading toward the place where he was known to be. There was no central plan, no strategy, and no coordination, yet within hours, a human shield had formed around the location. It was spontaneous, raw, and powerful. People came on foot, on bicycles, in overcrowded taxis. Some walked for miles. They didn't bring weapons or gear. They brought their presence. They brought their voices, their bodies, and their belief in what Traoré represented. Many of them had never met him in person. They had only seen him speak on television, or heard him mentioned with admiration in marketplaces and tea stalls. But for them, that was enough. He had come to symbolize resistance, dignity, and the rare hope of a leadership that might finally prioritize the interests of the people over the demands of outside powers. Those who gathered did not ask for permission. No one told them to come. They were not paid, nor were they mobilized by any authority. They came because they felt it was the right thing to do. They came because they understood that if Traoré fell, something in the soul of their country would fall with him. It was more than a protest, it was an instinctual uprising of conscience. Parents brought their children with them, not because they were careless, but because they believed the presence of families would prevent violence. And indeed, it did. The atmosphere around the compound was tense, but not chaotic. People stood in lines, facing the direction of the soldiers who had come to make the arrest. Some held hands, others sang quietly. A few chanted his name or quoted his words. At one point, women began to beat traditional drums, their rhythms echoing through the crowd. It wasn't a celebration. It was a warning, a heartbeat, a declaration of readiness. In every face, there was calm determination. In every gesture, there was dignity. They were not there to attack, they were there to protect. The soldiers who approached the area had been prepared for resistance, but not like this. They had anticipated hostility, barricades, maybe even a few armed defenders. But they were not prepared for the sight of grandmothers in headscarves, sitting calmly in plastic chairs on the road, or for the children standing quietly behind their fathers, holding handmade cardboard signs that read, He is ours, and do not touch our captain. The visual impact of such a crowd was overwhelming. It disrupted the entire psychological logic of the mission. These were not rebels or traitors. In the tense hours surrounding the attempted arrest of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, something emerged that no one could have predicted, not the authorities who gave the order, not the soldiers sent to carry it out, and not even those who stood ready to defend him. What happened was the surfacing of a unity so rare, so complete, that it shook the foundation of the country's social and political order. People from all walks of life, young and old, poor and privileged, urban dwellers and rural farmers, students and retired workers, stood side by side in unwavering solidarity. It wasn't planned. It wasn't orchestrated. It simply happened, as if the collective spirit of the nation had decided it would not allow this injustice to go forward. The divisions that often define daily life, class, ethnicity, religion, region, seemed to melt away in those critical moments. A university professor stood shoulder to shoulder with a street vendor. A traditional village chief exchanged words with a young woman from the city who had never before visited the outskirts of her capital. There was no space for suspicion or rivalry. In that place and time, everyone was simply a citizen. Everyone had come for the same reason, to protect someone they believed represented something bigger than himself. Normally, such scenes would have seemed impossible in a society often fractured by competing interests and decades of political manipulation. Politicians had long exploited identity, tribe, and language to divide the people and maintain control. Yet when word spread that Traoré's arrest was imminent, these tools of division lost their power. No one asked where someone was from before standing next to them. No one cared about accents or dress. They came together not because they agreed on everything, but because they agreed on one thing: this man, whatever his flaws, was fighting for something they all deeply valued: sovereignty, dignity, and a future they could claim as their own. It wasn't only the diversity of the people that was striking, it was the way they treated one another. There was kindness, patience, and understanding in the crowd. Water was shared. Space was made for elders to sit. Children were watched over by strangers. Songs were sung in different languages, but no one complained or corrected the lyrics. The unity wasn't just symbolic, it was lived and felt in every small act of care and cooperation. These were people who had been told for years that they had nothing in common. But in defending Traoré, they had found their common ground. Even the security forces who arrived on the scene recognized the power of this unity. Some among them had likely expected resistance in the form of violence or chaos, the kind they had been trained to suppress. But instead, they saw discipline and purpose. They saw their own families and communities reflected in the crowd. They saw their nation standing before them, not fragmented and weak, but firm and whole. It is difficult to maintain blind obedience to a command when the people you are ordered to confront include your own mother, your former school teacher, or your childhood friend. Observers who later tried to make sense of what happened would struggle to name it. Some called it a protest. Others labeled it a spontaneous demonstration. But none of those terms truly captured what took place. It was something deeper. It was an eruption of national consciousness. For once, the people did not wait to be led, they led themselves. For once, unity wasn't a political slogan, but a visible, living force. And it made clear that, beneath all the surface divisions, the country had a shared longing for justice and self-determination that no regime could suppress. As the hours passed and the threat of arrest faded, that sense of unity did not disperse with the crowd. People lingered, they spoke with one another, exchanged numbers, offered help. A street cleaner and a civil servant, who might never have crossed paths before, made plans to meet again. A woman from the north hugged a man from the west and told him, "Today you are my brother." What had brought them together was fear. What kept them there was something stronger: recognition. In defending one man, they had discovered each other. And that, more than anything, is what made that day unforgettable. Not just the failure of an arrest attempt, but the birth or rebirth of unity across a nation. A unity that had been hidden, suppressed, and doubted, but which now stood revealed in the faces of its people. As the threat of arrest loomed and the military vehicles edged closer to his compound, all eyes turned to Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The pressure on him was immense. In that moment, He had choices. He could flee, he could hide, or he could try to negotiate from behind closed doors. But he did none of those things. The soldiers sent to arrest Captain Ibrahim Traoré arrived expecting a routine operation. Their orders were clear: detain the man seen as a growing political threat, neutralize his influence, and prevent further unrest. It was supposed to be swift and precise. What they hadn't prepared for was the sea of civilians already gathered at the site. As they approached the compound, weapons ready and eyes scanning for danger, what they encountered was not armed resistance, but a calm and determined crowd of unarmed citizens. Men, women, children, the elderly, all standing silently or chanting, some holding homemade signs, others simply linking arms. This wasn't a rebel cell or an armed opposition group. It was the people. Almost immediately, the soldiers felt the weight of their assignment change. What had been framed as a simple arrest began to feel like something else entirely. They didn't see enemies in front of them. They saw neighbors, old friends, familiar faces from their own towns and villages. Some recognized family members in the crowd. A few saw former classmates, teachers, even retired officers they had once admired. These were not strangers obstructing justice, they were their own people, standing in defense of a man they trusted. The moral conflict set in quickly. These soldiers had sworn an oath to follow orders, to uphold the chain of command, and to carry out their missions with discipline. But what happens when those orders clash with the most basic human instincts, compassion, empathy, and conscience? For many of them, this was the first time they felt that tension so strongly. The choice wasn't between loyalty and rebellion, it was between obeying orders and preserving the bond that held their society together. The longer they stood before the crowd, the heavier their weapons felt. It wasn't just the physical weight of rifles and gear, it was the emotional burden of what using them would mean. To move forward would mean pushing through civilians, risking violence against those who were clearly unarmed and peaceful. Even if the order came, who would be the first to raise their rifle? Who would want to live with the memory of firing on a child holding his mother's hand or a grandmother chanting prayers? Some soldiers began to lower their weapons. Others looked to their commanders for guidance, but none came. The high-ranking officers who had authorized the arrest were far removed from the scene, perhaps already reconsidering the wisdom of their plan. The command structure began to fray. The soldiers on the ground were left to make their own judgments, not just as members of the armed forces, but as human beings. Among the rank and file, whispered conversations began. Some questioned whether Traoré had really done anything that warranted such an operation. Others admitted that they too had listened to his speeches and believed in what he stood for. Some even recalled the battles he had led, the risks he had taken, and the way he had defended his men on the battlefield. He was not a distant figurehead to them. He was someone who had stood in the mud with them, who had shared their hardships. That kind of loyalty cannot be erased with a single order. In the midst of this hesitation, the soldiers watched Traoré emerge from the compound, walking calmly to stand with the crowd. He was unarmed and composed, making no move to hide or provoke. His presence further deepened the moral divide. He did not appear as a man in hiding, nor as a rebel leader. He stood with the people, and in that moment, it was hard to see him as anything but one of them. As the standoff continued, a quiet shift occurred within the ranks. Some soldiers began to step back. Others leaned against their vehicles, arms folded, watching but not acting. A few approached the crowd, not to arrest, but to speak with people they knew. The lines between the state's force and the citizenry blurred. Loyalty, once tied to a uniform and a command, began to realign with shared humanity and a deeper sense of duty. Eventually, the order to proceed never came, or if it did, it was ignored. The operation dissolved without confrontation, not because it failed tactically, but because it failed morally. The soldiers had come prepared for conflict, but found themselves facing a truth they could not ignore. That day, loyalty shifted not in the form of a mutiny, but in silent, individual decisions made one by one. Decisions not to move forward, not to pull a trigger, not to be the hand of injustice. In choosing restraint over obedience, the soldiers revealed that even in the most rigid hierarchies, human conscience can still prevail.